a few exam questions, and these are based on the CSEC Physical Geography past paper questions. All right. Now, there are some things that I want you to pay attention to when you are answering exam questions. If you look at the examples that I have, the first one says define the following. All right. So for these, you are simply being asked to give the definitions or the meanings of the terms. Notice that these are, each definition is given 2 marks. So there is no need to go beyond the definition. If we look at the second question, it says, explain how temperatures change. Sorry, temperature change, it should be, and frost action can destroy rocks. All right. So if you notice the descriptive term right here is explain. Explain is asking for reasons. Notice that 2 processes are mentioned, and notice that you are being awarded 6 marks for answering the questions. It means that you would get 3 marks for one process and 3 marks for the other process. So even though it is an explanation, there is no great need for a whole lot of details. You have to pay attention to all of these things. Let's look at the third question. The third question is asking you to describe. It says describe 2 characteristics of limestone which make it susceptible to chemical weathering. And that is for 4 marks. When we are asked to describe, we are being asked to give certain characteristics of a particular thing. We are required to elaborate, but not necessarily to give reasons. All right. Just realizing that I have this word is spelled incorrectly, but please look beyond that. And the final question that I have here says, explain how climate and vegetation influence the formation of soils in equatorial areas. And again, notice it's explanation, and therefore there is a need for reason, to give reason, all right, or to say why what you're talking about is happening. Notice we have 2 factors, climate and vegetation, and we're being given 8 marks. So it means that more than likely the examiners will give 4 marks for talking about climate and 4 marks for talking about vegetation. All right, so let's see how we could approach these questions. All right, so for the first set, it is pretty straightforward. All you're going to do, you are going to write back the term and you're going to give the definition. All right. Don't make the mistake of just writing the definition and not making it clear which term you are defining. All right. So for example, we have denudation. And I think it's important when you are answering any question at all for you to try to figure out which part of the syllabus or which topic is being tested. All right. Obviously, the part of the syllabus being tested here is that part about external forces. All right. So if you familiarize yourself with the syllabus, when you get your questions, if you try to make a connection between the question and the topic, it would be easier for you to interpret the question and give a good response to the question, right? So what can we write for denudation? Denudation is the combined processes of erosion, weathering, and mass wasting, which cause the lowering of the land. That's one definition. That's one way of answering it. It could have been answered in a different way. We could have said that denudation is the process by which the land is worn down or lowered by the processes of erosion, weathering, and mass wasting. So there are different ways that you could define the term denudation, but you have to make sure that it is just correct. All right. Then notice that all of the terms that were given here are related. Right? So now we are asked to define the term weathering. Right. So we could define weathering as gradual, meaning that it takes place over time, disintegration, and decomposition. Disintegration is related to physical weathering. Decomposition is related to chemical weathering. All right. And remember that biological weathering can also take place as a physical process or as a chemical process. So it's included in the definition. All right. So it is a gradual disintegration and decomposition of rocks. And this term, I want you to remember to use it if you get a question like this, in situ. And what in situ suggests is that weathering does not move the material. It simply breaks it up or breaks it down. All right. So it is the gradual disintegration and decomposition of rocks in situ, and it's good if we could mention the agent or what is responsible for weathering. So we could write as a result of atmospheric changes as well as biological activities. Right? And sometimes you can't remember the exact definition. It's good for you to study the definitions of terms, but it is also important that you understand the concepts when you understand the concepts, it is easy for you to, at least it is easier for you to remember the definition. All right. So when you write the definition, you should not just be writing something, it should mean something to you. So every word within the definition plays a very important role in defining the term. As I said, in situ, we don't want to leave that out of our definition. We definitely cannot leave out rocks out of the definition. We definitely want to talk about atmospheric changes and biological activities as the main causes of the process. And then disintegration and decomposition talks about how the process takes place. All right, let's move on to the next term, which is mass wasting. Again, mass wasting is another type of denudation. So mass wasting is the downslope. You don't want to forget this. All right. Mass wasting needs a slope in order to take place. So we want to remember this term. It is the downslope movement of material, and then we want to mention the agent. In all of these processes, we want to mention the agents that are responsible. In this case, it is gravity. So it is a downslope movement of material. Some persons would be specific enough and put weathered material, all right, under the influence. Right. And then the final term that we are being asked to define is erosion. Right? Erosion is the wearing away of the land. Of course, the land is made up of both rocks and soil. So most persons know about soil erosion. All right. You are being asked for a general definition, so don't get specific for this in terms of soil erosion. So you can say land, and land will cover rocks as well as soil. All right, it is a wearing away of the land, and the agent is very important here in distinguishing it from other processes of denudation. It's the wearing away of the land by moving agents. And for this, you could actually give examples of the moving agents that you're talking about. So you could put example water, wind, waves, and ice. All right. And you should be able to get your 8 marks for those definitions. All right, so it's very important when you are preparing for your exam, get your study cards, write down your definitions, study your definitions, because look at that. You are not just earning 2 marks because you're being asked to define 4 words. So you're getting a whole of 8 marks. Okay, so study your definitions. Let's move on and let's look at the second question. So we're going to move this out of the way and we're going to give focus to our second question. The second question says, explain how temperature change and frost action can destroy rocks, and that's 6 marks. So let's try to figure out which part of the syllabus is being tested. Again, this part would also come from external forces, and Notice we are being tested on the topic of weathering. If you look at it closely, it says, notice it doesn't actually mention the actual name of the weathering process. So you have to have an idea of what the weathering process is, and try to identify it. So where it says explain how temperature change, all right, you might know the process by the term insulation weathering or thermal expansion. All right, but what they've said right here is temperature change. It's still the same thing. Right here, they're asking about frost action. You may know it as freeze thaw action. It's the same thing. So it is very important that you know, or you familiarize yourself with the different terms that are used as synonyms for the concepts that you are studying. All right, so you're asked to talk about temperature change. I would encourage you, like I encourage my students, when you're answering your questions, it's good for you to have your little subheadings so that your examiners will know exactly what you are talking about. So you're going to be talking about temperature change. So we could say temperature change involves rocks in desert regions. Now, maybe you'd get a mark just for mentioning the climatic region in which it is the process occurs. All right. So these little details can help you to get your marks. So it involves rocks in desert regions, being exposed to high temperatures in the day, which causes the surface to expand. Then experiencing low temperatures nights, which cause the surface to contract. And then we could complete everything by saying over time, the expansion and contraction will cause rocks to peel off layer by layer. All right. Remember, we probably even gave more than is probably required, but we want to make sure that what we're saying is complete. All right, and then we're asked to talk about frost action. All right. Again, for this one, we want to try to earn 3 marks. So we could say frost action involves rocks with cracks which allow water to seep in. During the night, when temperature falls below freezing point, the water freezes, causing the cracks to expand. During the day, when temperature rises, the ice melts and the cracks contract. Over time, the rocks will break up. All right, as simple as that. All right, now what I want you to notice, both of these are physical weathering processes. And physical weathering processes usually involve some amount of expansion and contraction, or probably just expansion alone. All right, so remember that if it's physical weathering process, you should be able to remember it's an explanation that you're giving. You need to explain what causes the rock to expand, what causes the rock to contract. All right, yes. And if you are clear in your answer, you should be able to get your full mark. All right, so let's move on to the next question. All right, so for this question is also a question on weathering. This time it is chemical weathering, but it also has to do with limestone. All right, so remember, limestone is a particular type of rock that we study because it is common in the Caribbean. And so for this question, it says describe 2 characteristics of limestone which make it susceptible to chemical weathering. So we know that if there is anything that you're going to get marks for in this question, it is for actually identifying the characteristics. But you can't just identify the characteristics, because the question did not just ask you to identify the characteristics, it asks you to describe it. So you want to identify the characteristics of limestone, and you want to say something about those characteristics. Now, if you're trying to decide what it is that you are going to say, look at the rest of the question. You're going to say how these 2 characteristics that you've identified make limestone susceptible to chemical weathering. All right. Now, what are the characteristics of limestone? Or what are the characteristics of any rock? Characteristics of rock include structure, texture, permeability, composition, etc. But it also includes color, all right, and we could go on. But we want to make sure that the two characteristics that we choose are characteristics that really assist and increase the rate of chemical weathering, which in this case, we know that the main process that affects limestone is carbonation. All right, so I think the best characteristics for us to put in would be, for the first one would be composition, because we know that chemical weathering influences the composition of the rock. All right, so if we're going to talk about the composition, then we should at least state what the composition of limestone rocks is. All right, so we could say limestone is composed of 50% or more calcium carbonate. We could probably stop there, but we want to say a little bit more. We want to kind of link it to why, even though it's a description, we still want to show why this this particular characteristic would result in increased chemical weathering. So we could say this mineral is changed to calcium bicarbonate and dissolved by water during the process of carbonation. Then we could move on to the next characteristic. All right. So another good characteristic that we could give would be permeability. Right? You wouldn't need to say what, you wouldn't need to define permeability just because it's not a lot of marks. Maybe if you were being given some more marks, you would probably need to give a definition of permeability, but at least you should know what you are talking about when you talk about permeability. All right, so permeability is the ability of a rock to allow water to pass through. Now, why is this important? Let's write. So limestone rocks have joints and bedding planes which allow water to pass through. So in a sense, it's as if you have defined permeability if you say that. As the water passes through the rock. It dissolves calcium bicarbonate. And that should give you your 4 marks. All right. So notice what I want you to do. It's very important. I know it's not an SBA, it's not a report, it's an exam, but you still want to structure your questions in a way that will make it easier for your examiners to understand what you are saying. All right. So you want to identify the terms and you want to say something about it, and you definitely want to link it to the chemical weathering process. And notice we have actually stated the name of the chemical weathering process that they did not clearly state in the question itself. So that is to show them that we understand what we're talking about. Okay, so let's move on. Okay, so the final question that we're going to look at in this video says, explain how climate and vegetation influence the formation of soils in equatorial areas. All right, so first thing, we're going to try to ask ourselves, where on the syllabus does this fit? We know that we studied tropical rainforest, and we studied equatorial climates, and we studied Latosol soils. So this question is about the soil and the vegetation and the climate that we studied. All right. Notice it doesn't actually name, it doesn't mention the soil, but it would be good for us. It's 8 marks. It would be good for us to when we're answering our question, if we could actually name don't just talk about soil in general. You want to show your examiner that you know the type of soil. In fact, you know the type of vegetation that is associated with equatorial regions. All right, notice it is for 8 marks. So more than likely, the way the examiners will give the mark, they will probably give 4 marks when you talk about the climate, and they will probably give you 4 marks for talking about the vegetation and the way that they influence the soil. All right. So again, the way we could, and this is just a suggestion. It's not that it has to be this way, but whichever way you write your question, just make sure that it is well structured so that, right. So we're talking about climate first. We could have talked about vegetation first, it didn't matter. All right, so we could say equatorial climates. We could say something about the climate. All right, want to talk about the characteristics of the climate, the general characteristics. Equatorial climates are characterized by heavy well distributed convectional rainfall. We said a whole lot in just one sentence. All right. So you don't have to write a whole lot of words. You can just choose your words properly. All right. So equatorial climates are characterized by heavy, well-distributed convectional rainfall along with high temperatures throughout the year. All right. We should be able to get at least 1 or probably 2 marks right there. Remember, we're trying to get at least 4 marks for saying something about the climate. Now what we want to do now is to relate the characteristic of the climate to the soil. So let's see what we can do. We could say Latosol soils which develop under this climate, or we could say in this climatic region, doesn't really matter, known for being very deep. Due mainly to the rapid chemical weathering which is facilitated by the high temperature and moisture condition. All right. And then we could also say, I'm not certain, maybe we could earn our 4 marks, but then it's better to be safe than sorry. So we could say something more. We could say heavy rainfall results in high rate of leaching, which removes most of the soluble minerals, leaving aluminum and iron oxide behind, which gives the soil a red color. So notice what we're doing, we're actually saying how certain characteristics of that are developed in the soil are related to the characteristics of the climate. And we want to do the same thing for vegetation. All right. So vegetation, what could we say? One of the things that we could do is, because it's not set in stone, we could name the type of vegetation that is associated with this climate. All right, because the climate is mentioned in the question, but the soil and the vegetation is not mentioned. And so we could say equatorial regions are associated with tropical rainforest. These produce a lot of leaves which are constantly being shed on the forest floor. And we could say, because we want to connect it to the soil, as such, Latosol soils are known for having a thick leaf litter. All right? And then we can think again and we can ask ourselves, which other characteristic of Latosol soil can I talk about that is somehow related to vegetation? So we could say due to the high density of plant population, there is a heavy demand for nutrients and then we're linking it now with the soil. This contributes to the soil having a low humus content. All right. So we've stated two characteristics of the soil. One is that it has a thick leaf litter, and secondly, it has low humus content. And we have shown how the vegetation of the area contributes to those two characteristics of the soil. All right, that's so you have to when you do your exam, students, you have to be reasoning things out. All right, and it's always good for you to practice as many exam questions. You might see something close to what you actually practiced, and when that happens, it makes it a little easier for you to actually answer the questions. Okay, so I will stop here. I hope that this video was useful for you, and if it was, I'm going to ask you to like, share, and subscribe, and you could also leave a comment. See you in the next video.